think on the digital side, this new environment has revealed a few things for us. One is our really deep dependence on foreign tech and how this is much more sort of ensnared in our geopolitics. And this is both like a big sort of strategic and economic issue, but it's also a deep sovereignty issue for us.
Welcome to Inside Policy Talks, the podcast of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm Peter Copeland, Deputy Director of Domestic Policy at MLI. In the face of rapidly changing technology, Canada is at a turning point in how it governs its digital economy and artificial intelligence. These challenges are compounded by geopolitical tension and economic stress. Over the past few years, Ottawa has attempted to move quickly on competition law, online harms, and AI regulation. Yet its online harms and AI were paused due to criticism, but are now back on the table. We know that these areas need attention as technology changes by the day, ever presenting new opportunities and challenges, but there's considerable concern about overreach, state capacity, and whether we're regulating technologies we don't even fully understand. And at the same time, Canada is facing weak productivity, sluggish innovation, and growing pressure to secure its economic and national security in a more volatile world. And at MLI, our work is focused on a core set of questions with respect to these issues. How do we design digital and AI policy that is not naive about technology, avoids copying failed models abroad, and still ensures technology serves human flourishing, social cohesion, and economic renewal, rather than undermining them? And to share his perspective, my guest today is André Côté from the Deus Institute. André works at the intersection of technology, governance, and public policy, and has been a leading voice on how governments can regulate digital markets and AI with realism, a democratic legitimacy, and restraint without ignoring real harms. So before we begin, just want to remind everyone to please remember to like and subscribe, as it really helps us reach more people with these ideas. André, thank you for joining us.
Okay, my pleasure. Great to be here with you today and eager to get into it.
Yeah, digital economy, a lot of things fit under this bucket, but as the pace of technological change seems to be ever increasing, there are a lot of different policy areas that are being addressed by the government and of concern to the public. And it's not surprising, I think, that the government has its hands in a lot of different areas as a result. But I just want to zoom out with a big picture to get your perspective here. How would you describe the moment we're in as a country when it comes to digital economy and AI policy?
Yeah, sure. That's a good starting point. So, I mean, I think as with just about everything in this moment, we're in sort of deep flux. And I think, you can look at it through a variety of lenses. Part of your intro was around the digital policy agenda, so call it kind of the governance or the sort of regulatory agenda. As we know, a few key pieces of legislation, fell off with prorogation right at the start of the year. So around online safety, around privacy and AI, around cybersecurity, some of which have been reintroduced, or the tea leaves are suggesting that they will be, but we're not quite back to square one, but we're back to needing to reboot those processes. We're also in the midst of a real reconsideration of a lot of our sort of core assumptions about our economy, or kind of foundational aspects of the economy, and a fiscal retrenchment. So we're seeing the 15% reduction targets in Ottawa, which is hitting all across government. And I think that's bringing with it a real reconsideration of a lot of like the innovation programs that have been introduced over the past few years. The government's just about to introduce a new AI strategy that I think is going to cover a lot more grounds than in the past. And then I think lastly, and we'll probably turn to this, but in terms of the geopolitics, we're now a week or so from Prime Minister Carney's big Davos rupture speech.
Mhm.
And I think on the digital side, this new environment has revealed a few things for us. One is like our really deep dependence on foreign tech and how this is much more sort of ensnared in our geopolitics. And this is both like a big sort of strategic and economic issue, but it's also a deep sovereignty issue for us. So I think, many things on the table that way, and I'm sure we'll pull in more of those threads.
Yeah, I think great to touch on many of these key points that we'll return to later. I want to draw attention to what I see as the various tensions or competing priorities that are at play in the digital economy space. Largely, I would see them as new, emerging, significant harms that people are concerned about, whether that's job loss, whether that's kind of the attention economy, polarization, increasingly online world, national security. On the other hand, a concern that our economy writ large and perhaps some of the proposed approaches to digital economy policy regulation that we're lagging in terms of our productivity. They're restricting economic growth. And then, yes, as you just alluded to at the end there, digital sovereignty is a term being thrown around. We're realizing that increasingly a lot of our supply chains and and the concentration of tech firms and the various components of the business supply chain that go into them they present geopolitical considerations. So how do you see? Do I have that right? Would you add or subtract something there? And how do you see these exist in tension?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summation. I think on the harms front, I think we're concerned about harms to people. So for example, in the social media space, that's sort of hotly debated. I think another important lens is harms to consumers, harms to a competitive landscape as a result of the dominance of a lot of these tech platforms, many of them foreign. I think that bridges to the second category, which is, I would say uh, the problem might be stated as sort of reassessing or reconsidering our economic growth model, with aspects like productivity being a key contributor. And, you know, a lot of these are like, as I remember early days of my career, it was like we were talking about all the same issues like 20 years ago, basically, right? Like low business investment in tech adoption, in capital, in human capital. And it's just sort of like fast forward, it's a lot of those same challenges. And then for each of those, you can sort of drill down into what might be the contributing factors, but we're still facing those issues. I would just point to, and maybe we'll come back to this. I think one thing that's really interesting about the Carney government's strategy on this front and this focus on big nation building projects. Um, so we're really doubling down on resource economy projects and on big sort of capital infrastructure, physical like goods trade infrastructure, like building ports and rail lines, and all of which I think offers great potential for the country. And hopefully, we're investing in like major productive assets over what really seems to be missing from the picture is a big focus on the digital economy. What is the digital infrastructure we need to be investing in, particularly in a world where we know that a lot of the value in the modern economy is derived through intangible assets, through trade and digital services. Those things also happen not to be tariffed in the same way that cars or
Hmm.
potentially even energy can be. So I've found that interesting that has not been a greater priority as part of our government's strategy.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I want to pick up right on that because I mean, one of the things that's been mentioned in the digital space is utilizing some of our defense spending to go towards AI, maybe developing an advantage that we may have out west with semiconductor technology. We also have a lot of early innovators who seem to then go to other markets once they've kind of created their innovative AI product. We have a few centers of innovation in Toronto and Waterloo. So I guess I'd like to hear from you then. What sort of aspects of the digital economy do you think would be ripe for greater attention now with this productivity question in mind?
Well, I mean, I think some again are like long-standing issues and that relate to like incentive structures set through public policy or tax policy or and relate back to even some of the long-standing questions about like, is it a business culture problem, is it a
Hmm.
so like for example, in the startup scale up space where we've done a lot of work. um, I think sometimes we're actually a little bit hard on ourselves because we're constantly comparing ourselves or benchmarking ourselves against the US, which is a vastly larger market and frankly like the best at this of any society we've ever seen. And so if we were to benchmark against other parts of the world, we wouldn't fare as poorly like in terms of venture capital investment or some of these. But I do think like a longstanding challenge for entrepreneurs is that in building and scaling companies is they really struggle to um, maybe slightly less access to capital than a few years ago, but access to purchasers. They really have a hard time doing sales with corporate Canada and via government procurement. And so when their market already, the like larger market already will be in the US and overseas, they're that much more incented to head out of Canada as quickly as possible because they're not finding that our big banks or others are ready purchasers there in the way that we'll see elsewhere. So some of those things are like long-standing issues that I think we need to keep on top of. I think others are really new and thorny challenges, like around some of the digital sovereignty questions. I think some of it is economic. This greater sort of realization that across many of the subsectors in the digital economy, we are basically like entirely dependent on large foreign companies. And so, we've talked a lot about cloud or about AI compute and the major hyperscalers. But I mean, you can also like go across our digital economy. You look at payment platforms where Visa and Mastercards and some others play a major role. You
Hmm.
look at business software. You look at or hardware. You look at live entertainment and the Ticketmaster Live Nation kind of monopolistic tie up that. So you have all these examples. I think we're only now realizing that that is a real you know, hampering us economically, as well as increasingly presenting a potential like security risk in some of these verticals as well. And so I think that untangling that will take some time. I think we'll need to be quite strategic about which places we're focused on and where we're okay. Maybe concert tickets is not really like the place to start.
Hmm.
But I think these are some questions where in our old worlds, we were somewhat just sort of inured to the fact that a lot of these big foreign digital platforms service providers were the biggest game in town.
Hmm.
I think we're increasingly concerned that from both an economic and like a security and defense perspective, this creates vulnerabilities.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to the adoption question and how it scores with productivity, but do you have a few examples that would come to mind in terms of where we might focus? I mean, we do have a lot of human capital and success, it seems, in the startup scale up space, but then they leave to go elsewhere. Companies like Cohere, we do seem to have some semiconductor capacity and compute capacity. in the West that may be explored further? Are these examples that you think Canada should focus on further, or do others come to mind?
Well, I mean, I think, in AI, and there's been much discussion about, the AI stack and where Canada is sort of best equipped to compete. I mean, I think it's pretty widely recognized that like trying to get into the chip fabrication game is perhaps not, like our highest and best use. And there are all sorts of barriers to entry and sort of phenomenal capital costs, but it does create a vulnerability. I think, I mean, that space is interesting because that whole supply chain um, is so sort of dispersed and vulnerable, like with, a certain critical supplier in the Netherlands, with obviously a lot of the critical fabrication in Taiwan. So that's kind of its own. I think, so we're kind of working our way across. I think, the broader consensus is where we will likely have more opportunities on the kind of application level, but while playing a part in some of those other aspects of the kind of the AI stack. And then I think like we kind of need to take a little bit of sort of a systematic think about other parts of the digital economy, and where from both like an economic and a security perspective should we be focusing our energies. Um, and so I mean, this relates back to AI to some extent, I guess, but like on cloud and AI compute, that's another. The government was actually a little bit ahead of the curve in introducing a sovereign AI compute strategy back in 2024, and we did a bunch of work to help to kind of inform that strategy. I think though, like there's a realization that we are not fully moving off of the big US hyperscalers anytime soon.
Possible.
I think, yeah, exactly. And particularly in the short run, I think the question should be more, um, what does it look like to firstly, how are we defining sovereign? I know that's being hotly contested.
Hmm.
Secondly, um, how do we start to develop some computing capacity that fits the definition of sovereign, and that basically like meets our objectives, particularly from like a security
Hmm.
perspective. And how do we think about like what are our highest sensitivity applications that we will probably want in that sovereign Canadian sovereign uh, compute. And so the top of the pyramid is likely our national security institutions and those types of things, some of whom might have like their own like on-prem servers, so they might not be operating in that space anyways.
Hmm.
But as you work your way down, like which like critical government like sort of applications or data do we probably want in, and then as you work down the pyramid, what are we largely okay with um, not being in the sovereign Canadian compute, or what do we want to work towards over the next 5 years? um, if sovereign would be only a very small share of the market presently, like what is our 5-year goal in terms of what share of the Canadian compute market would actually be defined under our definition as sovereign? And so just like a bit of a plan.
Hmm.
We currently feel like we're sort of scrambling about a little bit. What would a coherent sort of thoughtful plan look like to get there, recognizing that we're not kind of fully moving off of some of these um,
Right.
foreign vendors, foreign partners.
Yeah, well, this is kind of realism. I think there's a lot of talk about diversification, but there's a certain element of, geography and existing relationships and market share being destiny, and also, quite frankly, a lot of similarities, and not to make too much of a set of real changes, but ultimately, quite circumstantial and may in fact pass. But it's interesting what you say about strengths potentially lying in application. um, so that can apply across the technology space. But let's talk about AI, because we've actually published some research by one of our fellows, John Hartley, who showed that Canada significantly lags peer nations in AI adoption, even when the technology is already commercially available. So clearly there's an opportunity here. What can you say about ways in which we may increase our adoption and application rates, in particular in the AI space?
Sure, it's a great question. Obviously, like a hot topic at the moment, and we've done a lot of work there as well. Including we had a study out a couple years ago that we would love to refresh with new data called Automation Nation, but it looked at business adoption rates in Canada,
Mm,
and we didn't in our study do the comparative aspect. So I'd be curious to look at yours. But our finding was that in spite of all the call it the hype around AI, around generative AI, um, adoption rates remained quite low. Um, as of 24, I believe it was, they'd grown based on our data, which was StatsCan business survey data, had grown to about 8%, up from about 4%. Um, and and some of the trends are a little bit familiar. Adoption rates higher amongst higher productivity or more commonly tech adopting firms. Adoption rates higher amongst larger enterprises, much smaller amongst small businesses. And we know much of our economy is small businesses, so that helps too. Um, Adoption supported through um, companies that invest in human capital and in upskilling and those types of things. Like a lot of it's like reasonably sort of common sense. I think that on a very practical level, and we've also been doing training programs and other things. So we're with the nonprofit sector, with folks in the public sector. I think one of the challenges over the past couple of years is there's a bit of a tail wagging dog issue here where everyone is being encouraged to adopt. And I mean, the reality is like adoption has to tie to some kind of business need,
mm,
right? And I mean, you almost need to sort of flip the equation, or sort of invert the equation and sort of say, what are the types of business challenges, whatever type of business you're in the private sector, in a nonprofit organization, in a government department, what are the types of business challenges you're facing, and how do you consider the use of these new generative AI tools or other pre-existing types of AI as part of your toolkit for potentially solving this business challenge, and potentially just like one aspect of your workflow, rather than thinking of them as these like kind of like fix all, sort of silver bullet types of tools. They're just one more tool in the toolkit for supporting the ongoing challenge businesses face around sort of modernizing their business processes, finding more efficiency,
mm.
augmenting the capabilities of their staff. I think the other point we'd make, and we put out a study last year um, where we looked at the productivity impacts, the short-term productivity impacts of adoption. And so, a critical caveat: the data we had access to was businesses that had adopted AI between 2020 and 2022. So it was like right before the Chat GPT moment. So a key caveat. But the finding was that there was no productivity difference between AI adopting businesses and those who had not in that period. And we didn't take that to mean there will not be productivity benefits over the medium to longer term, but just that some of the narratives around this being a silver bullet on the productivity front um, are probably, you know, being overhyped as well. And frankly, this links closely to a lot of the tech adoption trends from the past. When you go
Hmm.
back to the internet or the personal computer, or like this is not a new phenomenon, that it actually takes a little bit of time for businesses to
Hmm.
figure out how to move beyond experimentation, figure out how to properly deploy these tools and derive like real business value and productivity enhancement.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I can't recall the name of the author of this provocative book or study, where it basically says technology actually leads to no increases in productivity, and it's because the devil's in the details. Like oftentimes people rush to adopt, and then they realize that it's actually embedded in a cost saving exercise. They're trying to cut out oftentimes people to save costs, and they don't
Yeah.
realize how many different functions various people perform, and then you end up with lower productivity. But in fact, they can be very productivity enhancing when the overarching objective is to enhance kind of existing worker productivity, and not be about a primarily a cost cutting exercise. But this is a good opportunity to shift from talking about all of the very clear potential that exists for improvements to our productivity and innovativeness as a country, from harnessing these various technologies to the very real concerns and threats that exist out there, that I think we're just seeing from people across the political spectrum. There are concerns that it's really eroding social life, a social trust, even, and human well being. I can think of a few examples. Anonymized and disembodied interaction. People spend large and large amounts of time now just in kind of a digital world. Links to poor mental and physical health, loneliness and social isolation, the kind of polarization that comes from this, digital world in which your inhibitions are lowered because you're not talking to anyone, and even a kind of set of business practices commonly associated with the attention economy that are kind of built on maximizing attention through psychological manipulation. So that's a long list of things there, but we want to basically increase adoption to a certain extent because it can have a number of benefits, but there are a lot of real risks. So, how do you think about this question in the big picture, and then let's talk about some of the specific applications where this occurs.
Sure. I mean, I think the attention economy issue is really the upstream challenge to a lot of the downstream like manifestations that we're trying to grapple
Okay.
with, like in the policy space. So, for example, and we might be turning to it, but it's like it is the upstream business model logic of social media platforms, and so it does raise serious questions about um, should we be focused upstream on business model and the resulting design of these platforms, or downstream on content questions. And that's a really tricky one, and it also links to our capabilities in governing and regulating in these spaces. I think related um, is the whole ad tech marketplace, which to a large extent is what social media is feeding, and is dominated by Google and Meta, and is subject to all sorts of competition challenges and investigations in Canada, but also in the U.S., in Europe. So I think um, I think it's a really key question. Where should we be focusing our energies? Um, and it's tricky because the ad tech marketplace is really intentionally opaque, like the way those various marketplaces work. How ads are served directly to us. Third party data sales and brokers, all of these aspects. So I think it's been particularly hard for regulators or policymakers to kind of wrap their head around and think of solutions, and also for your general user doesn't really have any sense of what all that is happening behind the scenes. They're only experiencing these platforms in the very kind of visceral ways that they do, right? So
Yeah, no, well, this I think it's a really excellent distilling point, if I've understood you correctly, which is that the business models that are collectively known as the attention economy, commodification of data, maximizing attention through quasi, if not outright, psychological manipulation, fostering addictiveness, but all of the other issues that people are recognizing, such as mental health, polarization, etc., are downstream of that. So, how of the various policy tools available, such as regulating aspects of the business model or the product features, competition policy is another one that's thrown around here. What do you see as the most promising, and especially in mind of not wanting to be too having adverse effects on innovation and economic growth, that sort of thing?
Well, I think we need to be doing a bunch of things simultaneously, and I don't think there will be any perfect solutions. So on the one hand, on the competition front, um, I mean, there are like monopolistic or oligopolistic aspects in many of these digital markets. Um, like that is not supportive of competition in Canadian digital markets or the advancement of Canadian firms or et cetera, et cetera. And so I think we need to, like other jurisdictions have been doing, like identify predatory commercial behavior and crack down on it, investigate, use the enforcement tools that we have to ensure there is like a fair marketplace for especially for Canadian businesses, and there will also be some large Canadian companies who are sort of practicing these, as we've talked about. I think then we need to think about harms and consumer protection for users or consumers on these platforms. And I think that's where like online safety legislation comes in, which is something we've been working at for 5 or 7 years now through the first two kind of failed iterations of the bill, and we feel like we're getting closer. And there's a signal from Ottawa that a new bill will be coming. And I think that you know I know that the dividing line on this bill will be around how expansive is the scope and will there be a regulator?
Mm-hmm.
And I find it's a bit of like in the absence of a regulator, how would a governance framework work, right? If there was no one there with the expertise and the horsepower to undertake investigations and exercise in like their enforcement powers in the event of like contravention of these laws, what is the point of passing them in the first place, right? So I think that there are places where we need these bodies, and we have comparable ones under privacy legislation, for example, with the federal privacy commissioner, and also with provincial privacy or information and privacy commissioners across the country. So there's and we have examples in other jurisdictions, like in the UK or like in the European Union. And I mean, like the most like practical recent example I thought was super instructive was so this whole instance around on X, um, the Grok AI tool, basically creating these nudified images at scale, like really grotesque stuff, right? And this became like a huge international scandal. Where the company lands on all of it is they said, well, you know what, from a business model perspective, coming back to the attention economy, this is fabulous. This is the most engagement we've ever had on the platform. And it's like, okay. And what they said in their response to the furor was basically, okay, fine, we'll shut down this capability in the jurisdictions where it is illegal, and we won't necessarily in other places where it isn't. And where does Canada fall? Well, we don't have a law in the books. We don't have a regulator to be able to quickly jump into action um, and enforce in the way that the UK now does and the EU now does, even if aspects of their regimes can certainly be critiqued. So, I mean, I think that is obviously a very critical vector. And then I think like other really sort of challenging areas that are tougher for policymakers or those types of instruments to wrap our heads around. Um, Although we're starting to uh, online financial fraud and scams, a huge problem. And I think, on social media, although like our research finds, Canadians in all demographic categories, including older Canadians, are users of social media. They might use different platforms, they might use it a little
Mhm.
bit less, but really all Canadians, it's pretty ubiquitous. But use is really concentrated amongst younger Canadians, and that's the primary place they get their information and news and et cetera, et cetera. So obviously, there's more of a focus on kids and youth in that space. On the fraud and scams, I mean, it really truly is people of all ages and stages, and to a large extent, it's like the stories you hear of, grandma falling for some of these various types of phishing scams, other types
Mhm.
of. Um, so I think like far more effort there, and some of that can be focused on the platforms where a lot of this is happening. Or I had to cancel a credit card a couple weeks ago because the top sponsored search result on Google was a totally fake site for a Canadian boot company. The site was a totally um, fake site out of China that just captured my credit card information.
Hmm.
Um, so this is a huge vector. I think we need to
Yeah.
focus on. And then there are issues of mis and disinformation, which are even thornier.
Yeah, great. Well, I want to stay. There was a lot you addressed there. I think very
Sure.
well with respect to the attention economy, just underlining where, like that is a very significant issue. But online harms, yeah, the second kick at the can, or maybe third if there were false starts. I'm not sure. You've been at it. You could probably give us the accounting, the timeline. Um, I think very justified pause because if we're looking at what's going on in the UK right now with respect to so-called hate speech and basically content restrictions on political speech, I think um, there's very clear signals from the Canadian public that we don't want that sort of thing, and I think we've seen some serious backlashes in some unseemly forms around the Western world as a result of attempts to get into that space. And so I suspect anyway the second iteration will focus more on, yes, harms to youth primarily, but also other types of let's just call it like illegal or extremely unseemly content that isn't aimed at expressing one's opinions. And I'd love to talk to you further about what you think a regulator would need to have in place to be effective, and also if you could comment on what's been going on around the world that are good examples. I mean, Australia has just passed, its ban on social media for under 16, is it? And we're looking, it seems, at under 14 or 13. So I'm certainly open to the idea that this can be done right, but I think there's a lot of warranted concern that it's going to create an unwieldy bureaucracy. It's not going to be that effective. And there are concerns about getting into content too much. So how do we thread the needle there? Do you think we're going to be able to do it? And if so, how?
Um, well, I mean, maybe to start on the hate speech aspect, I think that I can certainly understand the concerns around free expression and the concerns around the potential for like excessive content moderation, and in the spirit of being proactive. And this was certainly the concern in the first couple go rounds of the bill, which would have included, you might recall, the what was it, like the 48-hour platform takedown rule. And the concern was that would sort of incent platforms to then be sort of proactively taking stuff down so that they aren't having their hands slapped. So I think we need to be careful about those things. I think on hate speech, though, and this is not my area of expertise, but I've had some discussions recently with folks at the Canadian Anti-Hate Network and some of these other groups. Like it's quite well defined in law. It's like it's already illegal, beyond certain thresholds. Part of our challenge right now is it's not being enforced online, and some of that is on the platforms, certainly. Some of that is also on Canadian law enforcement that is not acting on it. I'm not entirely sure why. I get it. Anything in this kind of speech category is tricky, but it's not as though this is not an area that has been we're not coming at this fresh, right? Like there is very well established like sort of case law and other things in these spaces, from what I understand. So I think that's an important piece. I think the last version of the bill, the third version, or no, sorry, I guess it was the second version that failed to pass at the start of the year. The core part of the bill, of Bill C-63, included these 7 content categories, but it's been working towards a compromise, like a sort of toned down version from the first. Two of those categories would be sort of the highest priority, and those both were sort of focused on types of content related to kids. Broadly, it would have also included um, putting duties on the platforms, like duties of care with regards to users, with regards to children. And then it would have included these sort of regulator components. I think there was a sense that, and then the parts that were particularly controversial were the other parts of the bill, which included changes to the criminal code and whatnot, which were eventually stripped out, but it was kind of too late in the game. I think, the signals we have is that a new bill would focus on that core first sort of governance framework part of C-63, probably, tweaked in some respects. But would be kind of like a skinny version of the bill that could dispense with some of the other parts that were more controversial. So more of kind of the compromise package that we've worked towards over the last few years. I think what exactly the regulator would look like, honestly, I'd have to do a little more homework to give you, a very specific picture. But I do think there's a benefit to being a third, fourth, fifth mover here, where we now have a few of these regimes that have been in place that we can take a look at and figure out what's been working and what hasn't been working. And I certainly think, one of the provisions in Europe, for example, was that platforms were required to conduct what were called systemic risk assessments of their own platforms, of the content and the activities on the platforms. I think the sense was, even from some of the kind of civil society advocates who had initially like pushed for those types of steps, that it was a lot of work and maybe not that much value in what was being produced. And so I think there's a good learning there. Like, okay, so maybe we don't need some of those aspects. Maybe we can strip some of those away. What are the core components that we feel like we really need in order to make this work? Hone in on that. And I think there's certainly learnings, to be had from Ofcom in the UK, some of their early experiences. I don't think anyone would say it's all gone perfect, but we're all, this is all this is all new terrain. And so I think we have some learnings there in terms of what might the right package be for a Canadian approach, and maybe it's streamlined a little bit, and what can we learn from what's worked and what hasn't worked in some of these other jurisdictions.
Yeah, I suppose we have that benefit, having watched others try and partially succeed and tweak accordingly. I do think that's a fair point about hate speech, and rightly, I think the government has also paused the amendments to the definition of hate speech, which would have been, I think, inviting further broadening of the term, which gets into the issue of ultimately there's a lot of subjectivity involved. So I just want to, before we move on to AI, if you could comment on the social media restrictions for youth, and what you think of that, how to do it well.
Sure. So I mean, I think I commend Australia for taking a bold step. I think it's another example where they will be a bit of the guinea pig on this policy. And I think we'll really see in real time whether it works. And I think whether it works is a question that exists on a few levels.
Mm-hmm.
The first will be like the actual design and application of the policy. And is it
Mm-hmm.
actually keeping under 16s off of social media? Anecdotally, from what I've heard, it's a very mixed early experience. You have some youth who are saying, who are not that fussed either way and are kind of going along with it, and response has been pretty good. You have others who found workarounds through VPNs or have shifted to other platforms that are not part of the kind of top 10 that are covered, which is one of the big concerns because it could push them to more fringe platforms that might sort of deepen the challenges. And then I think there's kind of the longer term question will be, what will the actual impacts on youth be in terms of some of the broader concerns that we were trying to solve for in the first place around youth mental health, around like youth learning outcomes in school, et cetera, et cetera. I think in the Canadian context, I'm curious that what was trial ballooned recently was the under 14 because it's like they went 16, we're trialing under 14. France just went 15. It's like, okay, maybe there's a good reason for that I don't quite understand. Um, I think the key point is like we cannot proceed with that at the exclusion of the broader governance framework. If that were to be a component of the broader governance framework, that could certainly make sense. And we could choose to include it. If the government's going to table a bill in the spring, we could choose to include it at this juncture, or we could think about it and come back once we've learned more from Australia and some of these other places. I'm very open to both of those,
Yep.
but it is not a substitute for the broader framework.
Oh, very well put. Yeah, it's a kind of live experiment, as you say. I think there's a lot to be said for the strong signal here because a lot of people feel a bit beholden to this, amorphous network of pressures and institutions that they must or can't escape from, and very clear evidence of harms. But then, as you say, the policy design is everything. It can have all of this leakage and spilling effect. So, I for one am happy to see us. Pursue it, but needs to be very well done. So before we conclude, Andre, let's talk about AI, because the government also put forward a policy here and received some positive support, but also a lot of feedback, and have just finished or are processing the many submissions they received on the last consultation they opened up for the new framework. So some of the issues with the first one was that they were focused on high impact AI systems, which may not have been the right approach. AI is a fairly amorphous thing. In fact, like, it has many different applications, so does it really make sense to regulate it at that high level? And then the other question is, what are the specific harms involved, and do we just need to focus on figuring out what those are, and do our existing laws in various domains already apply there? They may just need to be tweaked and what have you. Those are some of the concerns raised. On the other hand, there's some good examples of, I think, how not to over-regulate so as to dampen investment and productivity and innovation, and in particular, the EU and the UK kind of stand out there. I mean, the Draghi report did note this, in fact, that an overly restrictive approach to digital markets and digital economy in the EU has hampered their productivity
Yeah.
and economic approach. So here we are again, back at the can, another kick at the can, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about what you think needs to be improved in the second time around, what you're hoping to see from the new AI framework.
Sure, that's a good question. So, I mean, we um, we do a lot of work on AI, and our work in the last couple years has been in various, call it, domains in the AI space. So we've done work on a lot of work on AI in the workforce, including like some economics work, looking at the AI exposure of different occupations and where that might take us. A study actually coming out this week on the AI exposure of the banking sector, which is very interesting. We'd already done one on the public sector and we have other ones coming on the nonprofits and the kind of the arts and culture sector. And so very different sort of workforce profiles. As mentioned earlier, we've done a bunch of work on AI compute, AI infrastructure, on adoption and some of these productivity questions. And most of this, really our lens is, I would say, on kind of the growth side of things. And then we also, I would say our overarching kind of philosophy is around, like, you need both growth and guardrails. Like, that is sort of the sweet spot. How do you achieve the right balance? So we have also done work on the governance side, including a lot of work looking at that ADA bill from last time, the AI and Data Act. I think that, firstly, importantly, the government has signaled that it is not an immediate priority for them bringing back AI legislation. I think, and we could do a whole postmortem on ADA. I think, and having worked in government and as a political staffer, and not to throw folks under the bus, but I think that bill was in trouble from the day they launched it, in part because they had done so little preconditioning and consultation around it that there were really no constituents for it. Even the day it dropped, it was kind of attacked from all sides. Um, it was it was framework legislation that, in the absence of trust, because of the way it had come about, raised a lot of concerns. When actually advancing framework legislation that you fill in through regs might not be a bad way to do it, as to your point, in a very fast moving space. You're not going to get it all right in a highly prescribed bill. So maybe you flesh it out over time. But I think because of the way they introduced it, people weren't really that open to it. That included requiring more specificity around those categories of high impact, which they rolled out kind of late in the game. And so there were a whole series of problems. We did a bunch of submissions and other reports trying to help finesse it, but I think that was sort of in trouble from the get-go. I think clearly there's more of a focus now on the growth side than on the guardrails side. I think honestly, and this was the crux of our submission into this AI consultation process. You really do need both, because like wide scale adoption, and the minister has said this, will advance at the pace of public trust, right? And public trust in Canada is particularly low, and I think it's linked to the fact that there is a perception and a reality that we are not governing these technologies. So I really do think putting in place the appropriate guardrails can be very supportive on the growth side as well. And so I hope the government is considering that. I think what will be interesting in this strategy that's coming is, our initial pan-Canadian AI strategy was reasonably narrow, focused on, really establishing ourselves as leaders on the AI research front. And frankly, we had a lot of success there. I think, obviously, we've struggled more with the commercialization of a lot of that research and creating a lot of homegrown companies. Although we have some, and we have some great ones. I think what'll be interesting in this strategy is they're seeking to bolt in a lot of components. And how do they all tie together? So it'll be research, commercialization, firm growth, and national champions. There will be governance. There will be skills and literacy, which is another place we're doing a lot of work, like AI literacy and skills development. There will be like a compute and infrastructure component, and there will be a security component, I would presume. These are all the things they sort of teased. So it's just like starting to get complicated.
Unwieldy.
But I think if you want to fully, wrap our heads around this issue, it'll have to be more expansive.
Well, I think that's a great point about trust being low and trust being essential for this to work. And now the question is, do you try to tackle it all at once, or do you do it in phases? Do you set out a skeleton framework and then build it out? These are the questions. I think you've laid them out there for us. So it'll be interesting to see what Canada does on all of these fronts in the coming months and years, in very interesting times where questions of our economic productivity, sovereignty, and place in the world, security issues, and the profound, every aspect of life-altering impacts, good and bad, of technology are significant and front and center for a lot of people. So this has been a fascinating conversation, Andre. Thank you for joining us. Andre is at the DAIS, which is a public policy and leadership think tank at the Toronto Metropolitan University, working at the intersection of technology, education, and democracy. I want to thank you for joining us, Andre, and thank you to everyone for listening. If you found this discussion useful, please like and subscribe. It really helps us grow Inside Policy Talks. Thank you,
Okay.
Andre, for joining us.
Thank you so much. And thanks so much for having me. And a big admirer of your work as well. And so let's find some places to work together to fix these issues for Canada.
Agreed on that front. Thanks so much.